Good morning. My name is Robert Lauder, and I will be continuing our study of the book of Daniel today with Daniel chapter 5. Beginning with a quick review from last week, the book of Daniel is a 2nd century BC biblical apocalypse with a setting in the 6th century BC. Now, we'll remember from last week that an apocalypse is a form of literature that follows several conventions, among them that there's some knowledge that's known only to God and it's passed to a single person in a vision and it's given in a sealed document. These are some of the conventions that are usually used. Another one is that it's always takes place in a time previous to the author. In this case, the book of Daniel, it's written in the 2nd century during the time of the Seleucid kings, the Greek occupation of the land of Israel. But it's set in the 6th century BC in the time of the Babylonian exile. There are two parts to the book of Daniel. The first is a set of 6 court tales that appear in chapters 1 through 6 and includes what we're talking about today. It's written mostly in the language of the 2nd century BCE, which is Aramaic. And then there are 4 apocalyptic visions in chapters 7 through 12 that are written mostly in Hebrew. But the message of the entire book, in essence, is that just as the God of Israel saved Daniel from his enemies, so he'll save all of Israel in their present oppression under the Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes. This book, Daniel, influenced the authors of the Gospels and of the book of Revelation. The artist Rembrandt actually painted a scene from Daniel chapter 5, and that's seen here in the upper right. In it, Belshazzar, who was nominally the son of Nebuchadnezzar, actually Nebuchadnezzar's son had a different name, and there were a few people in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, but the author of the book of Daniel can be excused for not having a complete Babylonian history at his fingertips when he put together Daniel. But Belshazzar and his nobles were blasphemously drinking from sacred Jewish temple vessels, offering praise to inanimate idol gods until a hand appeared and mysteriously wrote upon the wall. And the king, who was terrified by this, summoned Daniel, who then criticized the king for his lack of humility before God and interpreted the unknown message that was written by this disembodied hand. And the message said that Belshazzar's kingdom would be given to the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar rewarded Daniel for this interpretation and raised him to be 3rd in the kingdom. Not 2nd, not 1st, but 3rd. And that very night, Belshazzar was slain and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. Let's open our Bibles now and read the word of God in Daniel chapter 5. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote upon the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king had called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, You may keep your gifts for yourself, and may you give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to be put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life in all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Last week, we took our first look at this quick reference guide for biblical interpretation. We discussed number one, the genre, that is the literary form of different books of the Bible. And we also discussed modern literary forms, and we discussed the apocalyptic literary form in particular in the Bible. We also had a chance to discuss some of the history and the cultural things that were going on in the world at the time Daniel was written, and a little bit about the context of the book. So we're going to continue that this week, and we're going to take a look at another work and compare it to Daniel so that we can get a little bit better grasp of how the quick reference guide for biblical interpretation works. And we can cover another story that I was sort of prodded to cover last week. That story, which was suggested to me last week, was the story of Battlestar Galactica, a science fiction television series. Battlestar Galactica is set in a distant star system where a civilization of humans lives on a group of planets known as the 12 colonies. In the past, the colonies had been at war with an android race that they created on their own, these robots that were known as Cylons. And with the unwitting help of a human scientist named Gaius Baltar, the Cylons launched a sneak attack on the colonies, laying waste to the planets and devastating their populations. Out of a population of several billion, there are about 50,000 human survivors left. Most are aboard civilian spaceships that were not near the initial attacks of the Cylons. Of all the colonial fleet, the Battlestar Galactica, which was a museum, it was about to be retired when the war started. The Battlestar Galactica appears to be the only military capital ship that survived the attack. Under the leadership of Colonial Fleet Officer Commander William Bill Adama and President Laura Roslin, who was, I believe, the Secretary of Education when everyone else in the government was wiped out, she became the president. And the Galactica and its crew take up the task of leading a small fugitive fleet of these 50,000 survivors into space in search of a fabled 13th colony known as Earth. The episode that's of interest today is entitled Hand of God. It appeared in season 1 of the series. I believe the series had 5 years of runtime, but this was season 1, episode 10, and it aired first on March 11, 2005. So it's early in the story that the authors were trying to present to us. And the fleet is almost out of fuel. It's been pursued for 10 episodes around the galaxy by the Cylons, and it's almost out of fuel. Galactic has Raptors. These are like scout ships or fighter bombers. They're out on scouting missions looking at nearby star systems to find this rare Tilium ore. This rare Tilium ore is required to jump into hyperspace and make faster than light travel possible. If they don't find this Tilium ore, the fleet has enough fuel left to make 2 more jumps to escape the pursuing Cylons, who apparently have a lot more Tilium and can jump faster and farther than the Battlestar Galactica can. By the grace of God, an asteroid made of Tilium, which is this fuel that's necessary to the jump, is discovered by the Raptors. Unfortunately, the Tilium is already being mined by Cylons. Commander Adama of the Battlestar Galactica decides to take the asteroid by force. Plans are drawn up for the attack on the Cylon base on the asteroid, and Gaius Baltar, that ranking scientist aboard the Galactica, becomes involved in the preparations for the attack when Starbuck and Colonel Ty show him reconnaissance photos of the Tilium refinery on the asteroid. Baltar suggests that the best plan is to destroy the containers containing the volatile, unrefined Tilium precursor that are stored there right now, thinking that the explosion would destroy the Cylon base. This leads Colonel Ty and a pilot, the best pilot they have aboard the Battlestar Galactica, is named Starbuck, and they ask her, or ask him in this case, Baltar, to identify the containers. However, Baltar is a human scientist and has no idea which are the correct structures. So in his mind, he asks this virtual number 6, which actually is a Cylon, but we'll learn more about that later. And she talks to him in all of these episodes leading up to this, but this particular time, she doesn't help him. She tells him that it's in God's hands, and God will tell Baltar where to point on this reconnaissance photo of the asteroid base. Baltar doesn't hear anything. He just randomly picks an object on the base because they're waiting for him to say something. He's terrified, and he tells Six that he didn't hear God's voice, but she reassures him that God doesn't always speak in words. The attack begins with Cylon Raiders moving toward civilian freighters, but more are sent toward Galactica, initiating a dogfight that draws the Cylon Raiders away from the freighters. The briefing with President Roslin did not anticipate this action. And just as everything seems lost, the freighters reveal a secret squadron of 12 Vipers led by Apollo, who now has a clear path to the asteroid. Commander Adama admits to Roslin at this point that he strategically concealed this part of Starbuck's plan from the president's initial briefing. Due to copyright restrictions, we can't show you this video clip. So pause this video now and go to the YouTube page shown on the right. You can also find this link on the YouTube page that hosts our video. So out of all those facilities on that asteroid base, the hand of God moved Gaius Baltar's finger to exactly the right place. In another hand of God move, Apollo suddenly decided to dive into that canyon and follow the mine tunnels to get past all of the anti-aircraft fire. So, much to Baltar's surprise, his wild guess at which container held the volatile Thallium precursor was correct. And as Apollo flew away, the entire base exploded with the force of a 3-kiloton nuclear warhead. In Baltar's vision, Baltar is the man on the right in the photo here, and number 6 is the woman on the left. In Baltar's vision, he expressed his astonishment to number 6. He realized that the only logical explanation for what happened is that God truly did guide his hand to the right point on the Cylon base. And the formerly atheist Baltar is now forced to accept the possibility that he might actually be an instrument of God. What do both of these stories have in common? Both Baltar and Belshazzar experienced the hand of God. However, only Baltar acted on it in time and was saved from destruction by the Cylons. He actually saved the entire fleet by getting the Thallium. Baltar surrendered to God and allowed God to guide his hand to the right building on the asteroid. On the other hand, Belshazzar promoted Daniel to 3rd in the kingdom, not 2nd or 1st. Actually, 2nd in the kingdom was a priest of the idols. So Daniel was still subservient to this priest. The story makes it clear that Gentile kings must be subject to God and not become too proud or arrogant. They have to act with restraint. If they do this, then there's no objection to their rule. Only when the kings exceed their limits do they incur the judgment of God. In this case, the destruction of the entire Babylonian Empire by the Persians. Back again to the 7 steps of our quick reference guide for biblical interpretation. Modern humans are aware of this form. Science fiction is as recognizable as a letter or as a comic book. The next thing in our quick reference guide is historical and cultural. The timeline in the upper right shows the timeline from 65 million years ago to the present day and where humans came in, modern humans and ancient humans. The ancient humans at about 4 million years ago and modern humans at about 100,000 years ago. If we look at Daniel and Battlestar Galactica, that's the BSG, in this table, we see that we can answer the questions in our quick reference guide. When was it written? Daniel, 167 to 163 BCE, and Battlestar Galactica, 2005. Actually ended in 2005. It was written sometime before that, but the actual recording of it was in 2005 CE. When does it take place? Daniel takes place many years before it was written, in 586 to 562 BCE. And Battlestar Galactica actually takes place 150,000 years ago, but you don't find that out until the very last episode of, I believe it was, season 5. And what's going on in the world at the time? Well, in the time of Daniel, Antiochus Epiphanes was persecuting the Jews in the Holy Land. And in Battlestar Galactica, humans were hunter-gatherers. So in 167 to 163 BCE, we were in the Greek period with the Seleucid kings, and Antiochus Epiphanes was ruling the Holy Land. He conquered nearly all of Egypt, and he persecuted the Jews of Judea and Samaria until the rebellion of the Jewish Maccabees. In the Battlestar Galactica timeline, 150,000 years ago, Earth had mainly hunter-gatherers in the place of humans. And actually that persisted until about 12,000 years ago. The first agricultural communities and cities began to develop 10 or 12,000 years ago. And our anthropologists have discovered evidence for the practice of hunter-gatherer culture by modern humans and their ancient ancestors dating back as far as 2 million years ago. The next item in the quick reference guide is contextual because, as the slide says, context matters. Well, who wrote it? Daniel was written probably by an educated Jew who was knowledgeable in Greek learning and was of high standing in his community, but we don't know exactly who it was. Battlestar Galactica was written by Bradley Thompson and David Weddle. To whom was it written? Daniel was written to the Jewish people, and Battlestar Galactica was written to American television viewers. To sum up contextual, what we need next is to identify the purpose. We must state the purpose in one sentence of the writing that we're looking at. Now, for Daniel, the purpose of that book was to state that Gentile kings must be subject to God and not become too proud or arrogant, acting with restraint, or they will incur the judgment of God. And that is prescriptive as opposed to descriptive. For Battlestar Galactica, the purpose of the writing was descriptive and was to make money. Now, to make money is the obvious thing, because otherwise they couldn't do all of that animation and employ all those people. So it had to be the number one goal of the writing. But it does also have some interesting perspectives on God, the nature of God, on monotheism and polytheism. And that's one of the reasons why the show won a lot of awards. We're about out of time for now, so we'll conclude with our quick reference guide for biblical interpretation again. We've looked at genre, historical and cultural aspects, context aspects. Most of the lexical, theological comparison application, I think we're going to have to cover in the second portion of Daniel, the more symbolic portion with the visions in it. And that will be coming up beginning in about 2 weeks. Thank you.